Alrighty. Okay. Oh, I'm going to turn that down just a touch. There we go. Okay. Hey, we have a screen. Isn't that nice? Back. I'll dim that a little bit, make it a little easier to see. Okay, let us jump in here. Happy Friday. I guess the first full week of the semester is over. Wow, the screen is really, really close to the desk. Okay, don't complain. You have a screen now. Stop it. Okay, so we were talking last time about our definition of religion from Smith, right? So reaffirming, right? Basically, we've kind of gone through different parts of the definition already, right? And we were talking last time about how, religion is a complex of culturally prescribed practices. Okay, so basically, it's a bunch of things that people do that are, culturally prescribed in the sense that they come from people's culture and they are passed down culturally from generation to generation. And again, a single, human action doesn't make a religion. It has to be a sort of set of them, and they have to be repeated over time, right? And they have to be passed down culturally. Let me just see if I got everything. And they're based on premises about the existence and nature of superhuman powers, right? So something that makes no reference to superhuman powers is not going to be a religion. It's going to be something else, right? So it has to have to do with some kind of superhuman power. And again, won't redefine superhuman power. I spent enough time on that already. But yeah, without some belief, what you're talking about isn't a religion. And religions break down pretty quickly and tend to disappear once the kind of religious belief system disappears from them as well. Okay. Was there anything else I should? Oh, I think I got everything. Okay. So this is sort of where we left off just at the beginning of this slide. So what does Smith say, in this part? So, did we talk about personal and impersonal? Maybe okay. I think we did. I just want to make sure. Oh, I think this is it, partially it here. Okay. So basically, maybe I highlighted the wrong section in that piece of text, but okay, let's just go through this. So in terms of personal and impersonal, right, we talked about this. I know I've mentioned it a few times. Some of the forces that we talk about are personal, right? So they might be, something that's thought to have a mind, or a personality, wants, desires, a will, or impersonal forces, right, like karma, that don't. Okay, so what Smith says is that a religion, is one of these, culturally complex and culturally prescribed practices that seeks to help practitioners gain access and communicate or align with these powers, right? So the purpose of, animal sacrifice in Greco-Roman religion was to gain access or gain the favor of the gods, right? It was to get access to their power, and hopefully, in your battle with the Trojans or whoever it was, the Persians or whoever it was you were fighting, the gods would side with you, right? Or if you're talking about, say, something like prayer, prayer is, in a lot of senses, to communicate with, in kind of the Christian sense, to communicate with God, right? And to, in some senses, often align yourself with God in some way, right? Now, this can be, so these practices, right? So whoever the practitioner is, they can be trying to align themselves or gain the power of either a personal kind of force, right? So it could be God, in the Judeo-Christian sense, or the Abrahamic religion sense. Gods, right? The Greek gods, the Roman gods, Egyptian gods, or whatever religion it happens to be, right? If it's a pantheon of gods, you can be trying to, access them or, communicate with them in some way. spirits, demons, whatever it happens to be. You're trying to communicate with them or to sort of align or gain access to their power in some way. Or, right, it can be, in religions that posit impersonal forces, you can be trying to align yourself with them in some way. Potentially, again, it's a fictional example, but with the Force, right, aligning yourself with the Force could give you access to, the ability to move things with your mind and sense things, right? But if you think about, real religions, you might align yourself, in, say, Buddhism or Hinduism. Sorry, I shouldn't use Hinduism as an example here because Hinduism has a mix of personal and impersonal forces. But let's say you're trying to align yourself with like karma or Brahman, right? It could be to gain enlightenment, right? You're trying to gain enlightenment rather than, and that's seen as the good, right? A detachment from worldly things would be seen as the good, but it's not necessarily a personal force that you're trying to align with. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah, sorry. Okay. Okay, we'll switch the whole course to Introduction to Hindu Philosophy. No, I'm kidding. Brahman is sort of like and I'm going to get this wrong, and I'm sorry that I'm getting this wrong for Hindus. It's sort of like the universal force in Hinduism, right? The kind of force of unity within, well, not within the universe, that sort of creates the universe and holds everything kind of together. And then I think it's expressed in kind of the physical realm by the trinity of kind of Hindu deities, which is confusingly Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And please ask me no follow-up questions about this, because honestly, when it comes to like Hindu philosophy, I know a little bit and not a ton more than that. But yeah, it's sort of like a universal force. It's in different schools of Hindu philosophy, it's either considered a personal force or an impersonal force. For our purposes here, I'm just going to treat it as kind of like an impersonal force. But it's kind of like the source of all things, out of which all things come and to which all things go, but not like a person in the sense of like a deity in the world, if that makes sense. Okay, if it makes sense, good or bad, I don't know. Either I've got that completely right or I've screwed it up completely. What, like, am I going to ask you to define Brahman? No, definitely not. I'm just using it as an example. You'll have to come up with your own and interesting examples, but not to these particular points. And if anything, I will say, you'll have to sort of, say, like, what does Smith mean by, seeking to help practitioners gain access to or communicate and align with these powers, right? What does he mean by that? So, explain that part of his definition and give an example, right? That would be the kind of question you'd get from this, but not repeat Professor Broussard's poorly rehearsed definition of Brahman, which may or may not be correct. Okay. Can I post the Wednesday lecture when I get the chance? I thought I had, but I will double check, and if I haven't, I will definitely do that. Okay. How are we doing with that? Does that all make sense? I know you're probably tired of Smith's definition by now, but we are almost done with it. And then we're going to move on to a couple of other things, and then how religion works. Okay, so the last part of this definition, also I think pretty critical. What's the goal of religion? People, align themselves with these superhuman powers in hopes of realizing human goods and avoiding things bad. Now, that's a pretty broad way of phrasing it, but that's because, in different religious systems, what good things are versus what, avoiding things bad can have a great number of different sorts of meanings, right? Not all religions are necessarily going to agree on what the good is or what the bad is. So you have to define this fairly broadly. But what does Smith say, right? Why do people turn to superhuman powers? Well, they find themselves in conditions that they can't necessarily control, right? So they turn to superhuman powers in a lot of cases to try and gain some control or gain access to those superhuman powers, which they see as potentially having the ability to alter reality, right? So, I mean, this is, you're on the ocean in a storm, and you're afraid you might die, so you pray that whatever God, Neptune or Yahweh, Jesus or Allah will save you, right? Will calm the storm and sort of let you live, right? Whatever it happens to be, or you find out that you have a cancer diagnosis or a critical illness, right? You turn to a superhuman power for assistance, because you can't necessarily control those things. Okay, now one thing Smith says, when people can solve problems on their own, most people leave superhuman powers alone, right? Most people, and I guess this is an interesting point. We'll come to it again when we talk about how religion works. One of the things that Smith will suggest is that for most of the time, people are kind of either semi-interested or disinterested in religion in a lot of ways. So for most people, it will affect their lives only in kind of modest ways, right? And most of the time, people just go about living their lives and not worrying too much about God or the gods or religion in general, because mostly we just get on with our lives, right? And it's in those kinds of, we'll hear this when we talk about Peter Berger as well, it's often in moments of kind of rupture, right? When you find suddenly that you're face to face with mortality or something you can't control, forces greater than yourself, your enemies are all around you, that you turn to the superhuman powers, right? But mostly when you're living your day-to-day life, right? You're going to class, you're writing your exams. Depends how hard your exams are. Maybe at exam time you do turn, in fact, to superhuman powers. But you know what I mean, right? You probably are mostly interested in your life, and if you think you can solve your own problems, chances are, you don't turn to superhuman powers for the most part. Now, people might, seek superhuman assistance as kind of a redundancy or backup plans for conditions they can't fully control, right? Is this expressed in a Russian proverb, right? It's like pray to God, but also row towards shore. That it might be like, okay, I'm going to do my best to solve this, to get out of the storm by rowing the boat back to shore, but the prayer doesn't hurt, right? So people might seek, some redundancy or kind of a backup plan in case, for situations that they can't fully control. That may also be kind of where people seek superhuman assistance, right? They're still going to be work. You're studying for your exams. You're doing everything you can, but you're like, okay, deity whom I worship, either personal or impersonal, help me out with this exam. That would be super great. Okay, so essentially, that's what people are looking for, right? You're trying to realize things good, right? People want superhuman powers to bring about good ends and avoid things that are considered bad, whether that be illness, death, eternal damnation, whatever it happens to be, right? People will turn, or, in the case of my one friend in university, the great fear that you've gotten your girlfriend pregnant, whatever that happens to be, that's why people turn to superhuman powers. Not a religious person until, he thought he might have gotten his girlfriend pregnant. And then, the prayers sort of start flying fast and loose. Okay, so now, these aren't the only things that religion does. Right, so we're going to talk about some other things when we talk about how religion works, in terms of, some of what Smith will say are things that we definitely see in religion, things like community, identity, but he thinks that these things are more secondary to what religion is than what's contained in this definition. So we'll look at those, we'll see how we do for time today. We might start on it today, either that or we'll start looking at it on Monday. But There's a lot of other things, obviously, that come out of religion. Just that basically what Smith will say is that things like community, right? We often think of religion as community. These are secondary, right, to religion. You won't be able to see secondary, so I'm just going to put 2, the number 2. Yeah, so these are secondary to religion, right? And again, we'll talk about this later. I won't spoil it too much, but we see that a lot of those things are also offered by other parts of society. But this, right, access to superhuman powers in hopes of realizing human goods and avoiding things bad is something that really only religion offers, right? It's not offered by other kind of social systems and social actors. Okay, so we're going to talk about 3 really quickly, and again, this comes out of Smith's book. He cites Martin Reisenbrot, and basically 3 types of religious practices that we will see in terms of, what kind of things religion does, how you get these, culturally prescribed practices, what they look like. We can break them down into these 3 categories: interventionist practices, behavior regulating practices, and discursive practices. Okay, so interventionist practices. Okay, so interventionist practices are what you probably think of a lot when you think of religion in some ways, right? Basically, they're ways of establishing contact with the superhuman in order to control or manipulate it, right? Or to get favor from it, get it to do what you want. Okay, so this can, be things like wearing amulets, performing magic spells, saying certain prayers, right? Yeah, I could think of some very specific examples. I don't know how helpful they'd be. But, right, so like wearing an amulet, I have some Catholic friends who wear what's called a scapular, right? And basically, there's a belief in Catholicism that if you wear the scapular, you will not be subjected to the fires of hell, right? It's aligning yourself or controlling kind of superhuman powers or the will of God, the judgment of God in some way, right? But you can think of, all sorts of kind of religious systems where, amulets or magic spells or incantations or something are done to gain kind of control over the universe. Think of any kind of, I go to the Wicca section over at Chapters or on Amazon, and you can download or buy a book of kind of Wiccan spells, and that's basically a book of interventionist practices, that you could theoretically use to somehow, shape reality, right? You're accessing the forces of nature in some way, right? Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, you can have temporary interactions or even fusion with superhuman powers in a trance or ascetic state, right? So if you, let's say, are meditating, right? Some kind of meditative practices, you might enter like a trance-like state or, a state of kind of separation from the physical self, where you would be kind of either, interacting with or fused with kind of superhuman powers, right? So you might, interact with God or angels or demons or whatever or the universe, karma, whatever it happens to be, on a more kind of, I want to say a less concrete level, in a more kind of spiritual sense, right? And a lot of people, I've read some interesting accounts of people taking magic mushrooms, right, in order to achieve this kind of like religious ascetic sense, and either having like really wonderful hallucinations or, really terrible ones, right? I've heard of people who took mushrooms and, they suddenly thought they could see all of the demons that were floating around the world and tormenting humanity, right? So, it can be, it can be for good or bad. But yeah, like if you take mushrooms and you're like, wow, I'm now, some people will describe taking magic mushrooms as like pulling down the veil between the kind of physical and spiritual world, so you can see the spirit world because of what the mushrooms are doing. I'm not endorsing this, by the way. Don't be like, my professor said I should take mushrooms to experience the spirit world. No, usually I don't think it turns out that well, but that's the kind of way people describe it. And that would be, right, taking hallucinogens, we certainly find in some religious systems as a way of like accessing a reality that we can't typically see. Okay, and activating superhuman potential that slumbers within a person, such as reaching a state of enlightenment, right? This is often done through, symbolic actions, prayers, chants, gestures, formulas, living a simple life, like a life of poverty, right? And so like this can be, this usually isn't a one-off. This is often through enormous amounts of practice and years of kind of focus on repeating these actions to get closer and closer to that, right? So true like ascetic living, if you think of like, I think of like early Christianity, you had monks, right, that went out and lived in the desert, right? They lived in caves in the desert and they would pray and fast and do all of these things, for years at a time. And the idea was, right, to get closer to God, to align yourself more closely with God. But certainly in, say, Buddhism, right, people who spend years kind of meditating, decentering themselves, detaching from the physical world in terms of attachments, would be, trying to, reach that kind of superhuman potential of enlightenment, existing kind of at a higher pitch in some sense, right? Okay. I have a little video here.
Darkness beyond twilight.
So this is from an anime show called The Slayers, which is funny, and I remember it. But this is, she's casting a spell to access, a super attack. And this is kind of the idea, even though it's, this is clearly an anime show, and, you're not going to be able to blast laser beams out of your hands by reciting things. But it's kind of the idea, right?
Darkness beyond twilight.
Anime. It's The Slayers.
Crimson beyond blood that flows. Buried in the stream of time is where your power grows. I pledge myself to conquer all the foes who stand before the mighty gifts bestowed in my unworthy hand. Look, there she is! Let the fools who stand before me be destroyed by the power you and I possess. Dragon Slay!
So obviously, that's a silly example. What's that? Well, I figured it wouldn't work as well in this class, but okay. Everyone's a critic. Okay, so subtypes of interventionist practices. Right, so Reisenbrot basically says they're kind of subcategories, and he puts them in kind of these categories, right? So general practices that all members of religious communities should participate in, and there's a bunch of them, right? So and a lot of them are calendrical, right? So they have to do with particular times, observing religious calendars to mark time around 3 dimensions. So the vegetative, the state in which students find themselves at the end of December. No, I'm kidding. Things around food growth, the harvest, right, and bringing about, certain patterns in kind of weather to bring about like good harvests and such. And sometimes even, thanking, the deities, whatever it is, for a good kind of harvest. Okay, so there's kind of these calendrical vegetative ones, astrocosmologic or astrocosmic, right, marking certain cosmic events, the creation of the universe, the passing of the planets between certain points, right, which might mark fate or history in some ways. Some kind of thing that happens at a kind of cosmic level might be marked. You might think of here, in a lot of pagan religions, you would find like solstice, right? So think of like, though we don't really know what it was designed for, the Druid rituals that would have happened at Stonehenge, right, would have been astrocosmologic in their nature, because we think it would have been used to mark things like the shortest day of the year, right, the winter solstice, and the longest day of the year, the summer solstice, and other kinds of things that happen in the kind of cycle of time, right? The cosmic cycle of time. So it's like, the seasons come, right? These are the darkest days. These are the, the longest days. And, we mark those with religious ceremony. Yeah, John.
What's the difference between a pagan religion and a non-pagan religion?
So, I mean, pagan religions, the way it's typically used, would have been in sort of the Christian sense, where we typically use pagan, would have been any religions that, worshipped the gods rather than the Christian God, right? And that's typically how it's marked, especially European religions. So the Greco-Roman religion would have been pagan, Egyptian religion, the religion of the Celts, right? These have all would have been considered pagan religions. And it comes from the Latin word paganus, which basically means peasants, right? So they would have been the peasant religions, the ones that, because basically the peasants held on to these religions longer than the people in the cities in the Roman Empire. So they came to be called pagan religions. This is a weird historical term. Do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah. I've heard like people call Catholic pagan religion because they worship her like the Virgin Mary. Is that true?
That Catholics worship the Virgin Mary?
Yeah.
Do we?
Pagan?
No. Well, I don't think anyone other than Protestant polemicists consider Catholics to be pagans. And I mean, if you want to listen to Catholic apologists, they will tell you until they're blue in the face and you've lost interest, that Catholics don't worship Mary or the saints, right? That they venerate them, and there's a subtle difference between those things. They don't think of them as God or gods, but they think of them as sort of models to follow. So they venerate their lives. But yeah, this is a distinction that comes from the Reformation, where Protestants were like, we're the real Christians and you guys suck, so you're not Christians anymore. We're going to call you pagans because you suck and we hate you. And we don't want to listen to the Pope because that guy sucks. He's always telling us what to do with his funny hat. And so Protestants have long sort of wanted to tag Catholics as pagans. But no, I think every religious scholar would put Catholics in the broad umbrella of Christianity. So does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, but Protestant polemicists will like to do this and say Catholics aren't really Christian. And this is a discourse that I have very little time for. What was I talking about? Oh, salvation historical. Okay, the last kind of, one that we might want to mark. Things, that would mark specific events in kind of history, or specifically the history of kind of the interaction of, some kind of deity with the world. So the birth of a religious founder. The one you're going to be most familiar with for most of you is Christmas, right? Which I'm too lazy to write. Christmas or Easter, right, in Christianity. These are both kind of salvation historical, right? Because they are celebrations that all Christians are supposed to mark, and they mark, the birth of Jesus, and Easter marks, the resurrection of Jesus. So, if you want to be like strict about it, Christians would mark what's called the Triduum, which is, everything from Good Friday when Jesus was crucified till Easter Sunday when he was raised from the dead, right? So but those are kind of historical moments that also have to do with, in the Christian case, with salvation. And that's the kind of thing that you would get. Okay, does that make sense? Following me so far? So yeah, you have these different kinds of practices. Life cycle practices. Practices performed on occasions such as birth. So, you can have things like baptism in the forms of Christianity that say practice what's called paedobaptism, where you baptize infants. Bris, I think it's bris, in Judaism, where baby boys are circumcised. I can't remember the exact. I want to say it has to happen like relatively quickly, within a week or two of birth, but I can't remember the exact number. These sorts of things, right? So birth, entry into a religious community, right? So if you become a cleric or you convert to a particular religion, right? This would be, marked by a particular set of practices. to mark that. The affirmation of the religious community by of the latter by young adults, right? So typically, I don't know how this happens in different ways in different communities, right? Say in Judaism, when I want to say it's 13, when a young person turns 13, you have either bar mitzvah or bar mitzvah, depending on the sex of the child, but it's supposed to be an affirmation and entry into that community as more of an adult, right? So you're supposed to confirm your belief and go through a bunch of rituals that mark your entry into that community as a young adult. Different Christian denominations have different ways of doing this, right? In a lot of the older forms of Christianity, it's called confirmation, where the young person, again, goes through a ceremony and they're supposed to affirm their kind of belief in that religious system. Say in some kind of more modern forms of Protestantism, you might get baptized, right? You wouldn't have been baptized as a child because they don't believe in that, but the step of affirming your belief as a young adult would be to, get baptized, usually by full immersion, right? So it's kind of a confirmation or an affirmation of entry into the community as an adult, right? As someone who's taking ownership of your own religious identity. Marriage, right? Most religions have some kind of marriage ritual that people follow, specific words that are said. And like I said last time, places that it can be done, songs that can be sung, and all of those sorts of things. And of course, lots of things around death and dying. I think specifically of like Catholicism, because it's by far the religion I know best. So if someone is dying, right, they might receive, what's sometimes referred to as last rites, or in Catholicism is called the anointing of the sick or extreme unction, where basically they're blessed by a priest and their sins are forgiven so they can then go to heaven eventually. And then death, right? We have funeral rites in most religions, right? So it marks the end of someone's life in a kind of concerted and meaningful way. Okay, and links it, of course, with that superhuman power, that ultimate story of reality that religion tells. Okay, and then, obviously variable practices that react to unforeseen or catastrophic events. And this can be a wide range of things. But often religions will have kind of tools for dealing with calamity, right? They're often less regularized, but they definitely exist in religions. Okay, now what I'll say is not all of these are found in every religion, right? You might not have, say, in Zen Buddhism, an affirmation of the religious beliefs by a young adult, right? So, or a kind of ritual that happens around birth, or any of these things, right? So not every religion is, most of them have something around death, right? Some kind of funeral rite. But not everything is going to be in every single religion. But we do see some combination of these things, essentially in all religions. Okay, like for example, practices that are around salvation historical. Again, you might not find those in every single religion because they have different origins and different points of inflection. But you'll see some of these things, in every religion. Okay, how are we doing? Yeah, please.
I have a question about the dying and death for Catholicism. Is it called anointing of the sick?
That's the anointing of the sick is sort of the modern way that people refer to it. But I mean, it's commonly just called last rites. That's a very common way that people refer to it. And like prior to about 50 years ago, that's how everybody talked about it was last rites, which was always awkward when someone got last rites and then recovered, which happens. I've had friends for whom it happened. They thought they were going to die and they got last rites and then they got better. And then it was, so they changed the name to the anointing of the sick, to make it a little bit less like, well, since you're going to die, you got better. This is awkward. Just go on. You can get last rites, strangely, even though, it was referred to as last rites for a long time. You could get last rites a bunch of times. It wasn't a singular thing. It was weird, but which again is why they changed the kind of way it's referred to in English as the anointing of the sick. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I had a friend who got into a really bad car accident and they thought they were going to die. So the family had, anointing of the sick done, and then they got better. So they've had last rites. It's fine. They're still alive. They're doing okay. Anyway. All right. So, yeah. Oh boy. Okay. So some religious practices, right, can be performed by everybody. So, praying, prayer and a lot of other rituals, right, can be performed by anybody, right? You don't have to be necessarily a priest or a cleric or whatever that particular religion has as its kind of structure in order for someone to perform every single religious practice. Others, though, do have to be performed by advanced religious practitioners, right? That there may be like priests or some kind of cleric, whatever it's referred to, rabbis, imams, there's various names for this. However, there are certain things that have to be done by, advanced religious practitioners. There's usually some kind of training that goes into this, but yeah, there are some things that are going to be off limits for lay people, right? And lay people, like, if you've never heard this term, it's just ordinary religious people, people who are not clerics, right? The laity is just the not clerical part of a religious population. So, examples of this, right? Again, in Catholicism, to perform the Mass, right, you have to be a priest, right? I could not walk into a Catholic church and just pick up the lectionary and start reading the parts and have it be considered valid, right? So only certain people can perform certain things within certain communities, right? And this is going to be true to various extents across different religious communities. And again, there's an enormous diversity in religious systems as to who can perform what in what kind of order and all of these sorts of things, right? So there's no like hard and fast rule that all, religious services can only be performed by religious specialists. In some religions, yes. In some religions, no. Okay. And now here, as I was kind of alluding to, most of the time, most people, even religious people, are happy to do basic religious observance, right? That most people who even belong to religions, how shall we say, I won't want to say they're not that religious because that's not correct, but their religiosity probably is mostly kept to the basics, right? They attend, they keep the commandments, right? They do the Sabbath, they keep kosher, but they maybe don't delve deeply into Jewish philosophy, right? They eat halal food, they do all the fasting during Ramadan, right? But maybe, being Muslim is something, about them and they keep up with it, but it's not like they're going super deep into, Muslim philosophy or, becoming an imam or anything like that, right? Same with Christianity. Most people, attend church on Sunday, maybe pray once in a while, but, they're not deeply engaged in religious practice for the most part, right? And this will be like the bulk of any religious population is going to be people just kind of doing the basics. Now, that said, there are advanced religious practitioners who seek salvation or whatever other religious good it is, enlightenment or what have you, whatever the cost, right? And they're going to give their whole lives to it, right? So now I will say these are typically middle class or rich people for whatever reason. But yeah, this is going to be people who are very, very religious, right? Who spend a lot of time with it, who reach higher, levels than most people reach in terms of their religious practice and probably their religious understanding. And it's a very, very small percentage of people that are ever going to get to this level. Why? Because it's a lot of work, right? And most people are just getting by, right? They've got, in the modern sense, bills to pay, kids to put to bed and get to activities. And if they're going to be religious, they don't have that much time for it, so they do the basics. But a small number of people are going to be really deeply religious, and they're going to pour themselves into that kind of religious world with everything they've got, right? How am I doing for time? Oh, better than I thought. 10 minutes. That's awesome. That's so much time. So much time. Yeah, so some advanced practitioners might be recognized or be official religious leaders, right? Clergy or seers, shaman. Sometimes, or sometimes they might just be independent people, usually mystics or ascetics, right? People who often come up with a kind of unique religious vision and really plunge deeply into it, right? So there's all sorts of examples of this, right? Like I was talking about a minute ago, in early Christianity, you had the desert monks, which were just ordinary people who went off and lived in the desert in caves, and fasted and prayed all day and thought about, religious questions and salvation all the time. These would have been just ordinary people who, basically had no official status, but they were treated as like, mystics in some sense, ascetics in some senses. There's all sorts of weird stories out of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages about these people. They're an interesting kind of subcategory. Or even, if you take St. Francis of Assisi, I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy. Basically, St. Francis of Assisi is a medieval Catholic saint. And basically, he was a rich guy. His dad was rich. And he was going to go off and join the Crusades. But on the way, he stopped in a ruined church, and he thought he heard the voice of God saying to him, Francis, rebuild my church. And so he took that rather literally and rebuilt that physical church, and eventually, became known as this kind of crazy person. Supposedly he could talk to animals. It's the kind of story of St. Francis of Assisi. But he was seen as an immense kind of religious figure at the time. And my favorite story of St. Francis of Assisi is his dad was none too pleased with him. After he didn't go to the Crusades, his dad had paid for his armor and his horse and all that. Didn't go to the Crusades, and so he took his own son to court and was like, everything you own is mine, including the shirt on your back. So Francis, wanting no part of this, just wanting to give his whole life to God, in the courtroom, stripped completely naked and walked out. Leaving his dad and everyone kind of awestruck. And he went and basically lived in complete poverty and wore like burlap for the rest of his life. Became, an influential Catholic figure, but he was just a guy, right? We think of him today as a Catholic saint and the founder of the Franciscan order, but at the time he had no status, and actually the church looked kind of at him with the slant eye, being like, what's with this crazy dude who's talking to chipmunks, right? But he didn't care because he's a religious specialist. He's like, all I care about is God, right? All he cared about was God. I will let you question the motivations of the wisdom of St. Francis of Assisi on your own time, but he didn't seem to think so anyway. All right. Oh, I didn't clear this off before. Okay. All right. Another big category of practices are behavior regulating practices, right? These will be familiar, I think, to most people. These basically amount to religious shaping of everyday life, but with reference to superhuman powers, right? So they can allow or disallow certain behaviors, right? So, a lot of religions have prohibitions against premarital sex, right? Or against eating certain foods. If you want to take Islam and Judaism, right? The way in which animals should be slaughtered if you're going to consume them, what kinds of things can be consumed, right? A lot of dietary restrictions, these kinds of things. And right, this is all in reference to superhuman power, some superhuman power, right? The will of that superhuman power. You shouldn't eat pork because, God, Yahweh, or Allah has forbidden it in some way. All right, I have a little clip here. Hold on, we're doing okay for time.
So we are at McDonald's, and we're going to find out what kosher options we have on site.
Just think of the extent to which kosher rules would dominate the life of an Orthodox Jew, right?
Which 2 pages
even down to how
long.
you clean
Only
stuff.
animals with split hooves who chew their cud can be kosher.
The pigs don't qualify because they have split hooves but do not chew the cud. Very interesting.
Animal must not feel any pain. Animal rights activists.
Fish must have fins and scales. What fish don't have fins and scales?
Shellfish, eel, shrimp, and crab. I love all of those things.
Meat and dairy products should be consumed separately with a 6-hour waiting period in between. I totally forgot that I had put milk in my coffee this morning.
Hi there, do you have a kosher menu?
I'm sorry.
I'm just gonna have to settle for a milkshake.
Utensils that touch meat cannot also touch dairy unless properly cleaned per kosher cleaning standards.
Find a clean pot that has not been used for 24 hours. This doesn't look like it's been used.
Drop utensils in the pot of boiling water one at a time. Kosher wine can only be handled by Jewish people.
This wine is not kosher.
One exception is that if the wine is heated to almost boiling, it can then be handled by non-Jewish people. Why?
Man, Jews love to boil.
This is intense.
I foresee myself breaking this.
I'm ready to do this and go back to my roots.
So I have now officially stocked up for my week of keeping kosher with these 12 bottles of kosher red wine.
I bought all this food before we started this video, but I can't eat any of it.
I didn't know what I was going to be able to eat for breakfast, but it turns out these waffles are... Oh no! I literally just dropped all the waffles, but these toaster waffles are kosher.
Hi, welcome to Starbucks. Hopping out today.
Hi there, do you all have a kosher menu by chance?
Do you think this food today is kosher?
I don't know. It's like meat.
I don't know what kosher is.
No, unfortunately, no.
Do you have kosher options? Like, is it?
No kosher options.
What are we looking for, Jen?
Kosher alcohol?
Everyone wants to take a round of Jello shots, but Jello isn't kosher.
I don't know if what I'm drinking is kosher. It's tequila.
Kicks are kosher. Kicks are kosher!
Here's where I'm struggling. Almond milk creamer does not have an OU sign.
I woke up really hungover this morning and I was really craving a pulled pork sandwich and I completely forgot about the whole kosher thing, so here I am.
We're about to eat the kosher chicken that Josh prepared.
So I just got back from a camping trip. There wasn't really anything kosher.
Ice cream is hard to find kosher, so we actually got Dole Whip.
Little holiday holla.
I'm like the worst Jew in the world. I just got a tattoo. My Jewish ancestors are rolling in their graves. I think if I learned anything this week, it was that I do not deny myself of like anything that I want.
And I would just walk around the kitchen going, no, can't eat that, can't eat that.
By the end of it, it was pretty simple. Like it wasn't, like you could go to a restaurant and even if they didn't know whether or not the meal was kosher, you could kind of tell.
At restaurants and stuff, I guess I would try to just eat whatever seemed the most kosher instead of asking.
I think it would have been easier if I had like a community of people around me.
I went to a Shabbat dinner, which a lot of my friends do, and I don't always go, but I thought it would be a perfect opportunity, A, to hang out with friends, and B, to keep very easy kosher.
All props to people who do this.
I couldn't do it, and you do it every day.
Interestingly, right, one of the reasons that you have really large communities in LA, New York, and Miami is because Jewish people who want to keep kosher find they really have to cluster together to have enough services. Because if you're really keeping kosher and you're an Orthodox Jew, you're not going to any restaurant. You have to go to a kosher Jewish restaurant. Because, amongst other things, to keep kosher, Gentiles or non-Jews can't handle your food in any way. So anyway, it is, keeping kosher is this reference, a reference to superhuman powers, but you can see the degree to which, if you're an Orthodox Jew, it would shape your life in really, really profound ways. Okay, and that certainly Jews are not alone in this. I think I'm out of time. We'll talk about, we have one last slide, which I'll talk about next time, and then we will jump into how religion works on Monday. All right, have a great weekend, everyone.
I have a very quick question.
Oh, very good. I love questions. I'm just going to turn off my microphone because
makes sense.
I don't need to hear my voice of God.
The Francis of Assisi, he was a medieval...
So he was a noble. At birth, he was a noble. And, his dad was a rich merchant.
Oh, okay.
He was I think the third son or something. So, you know, initially he was trained as a knight and a crusade. He was going to go off on the crusades, you know, to reconquer the Holy Land and all that fun stuff. And on his way, you know, heard the voice of God and rebuilt a actual church, and then went on to deeply affect Catholicism in general.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So big career shift there.
Big career shift,
I
yeah.
love it. Thank you.
No problem. Yes, I added 10 seats and they were gone in like 5 minutes.
I got the notification and there was already only like 5 when I did it. So
It was crazy. I was like, do this at like 1 o'clock in the afternoon and it should be fine. People will be able to get it. And it was like gone in like 5 minutes. So.
I've been on it. It's like I'm waiting for like tickets or something. It's been intense. But I wanted to talk because I have accommodations. Is it going to be the same as last year? Like, should I just do it through you?
Yeah. I'll arrange it. It's all open books. So you don't have to go right with them.
Yeah.
I'll just add time for you. Yeah. And when we do the exams, they're open for like a 24-hour period.
Okay.
So basically, like, you'll have like whatever 2-3 hours or whatever your accommodation is to do it. And if I screw it up, just email me and I will make sure you get the right amount of time.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Howdy.
I wanted to ask, like, what would be the best way to start, like, studying for the midterm?
Cleverly and efficiently. No. I'm just thinking what the exams look like. So as we go through the concepts, just make sure like you're clear. Like, okay, so for the definition, right? Make sure you're clear on every single part of the definition. And then if you can, try to think of some examples of them, specifically examples that maybe I have not used, right? So give yourself a little bit of time to sort of like do some research as to say some, you know, interventionist religious practices or kind of life controlling practices, especially when we get to the next unit, which is how religion works. I've got like, I think 10 or 11 like things that religion does according to Smith. And I'll give examples of each of those. But when it comes to, and I'll tell everybody in the class this as we get closer to the exam. I'm not like giving you insider scoop. I usually do it a little closer to the exam. But, you know, I'll say like, okay, like explain this concept from Smith and give an example not from the course.
Oh, okay.
Right? So something that I said is going to be like verboten as examples. So you'll have to sort of like think on each of them. And because of that particular question on the exam is random shuffle, you will not know which of the, I don't know, like 10 or 12 different kind of, you know, I forget what he calls them. I should look. They're all, where's my slides for next time? Oh, nope, that's not it. He's got, mechanisms, causal mechanisms, right? So he's got all these causal mechanisms. Like, you can go look at these slides because they're already posted. And he's got 10 causal mechanisms. So yeah, you might have to explain what he means by, you know, deep culture and invisible religion, and then give an example that I didn't give, right? So as you're kind of going through, yeah, that'll be the trick, I think, is.
So you like study all of them and then have examples for all of them and then whatever is on the exam.
Yeah, so you'll get a shuffle. I think at most you'll get 2 of them, right? Because there's, I think, 4 questions that are assigned to particular units. So like, what is religion, how religion works, and then religious theories. And then there's another one, but it's escaping my brain at the moment. And then a 5th question that's just a shuffle question. So it'll take from the whole bank and just kind of pick a random question.
Oh, okay.
So, and there's a lot of like, there's a good range of questions because I've designed it so that, you know, 2 people in the class could be sitting next to each other doing the exam and they're not going to get the same question likely. Okay. So, you know, you can't just copy off and be like, I'll answer question 5, you answer question 4, and then we'll copy and paste from each other. I've already anticipated how people might cheat.
That's fair.
As much as I can, so.
How long is like short answer?
It's short answer, yeah. No,
like
it's
a paragraph or 2.
Couple paragraphs,
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be long. I don't put word limits or like maximum minimums because I'm just like, stop when you feel like you've explained it. Stop.
Yeah, okay.
Like,
okay, perfect.
Because otherwise people are like, I wrote 250 words, but he said 350. I have to write 100 meaningless words,
Right, okay.
right? So, but yeah, and I promise, like as we get up to the exam, I will explain this in great depth. Like one of the things that I don't believe in is like surprising students with formats of questions or you know, categories that they weren't expecting. But sometimes that skews to people doing a little bit better than the university might want them to do on the exams. But I always try to be really straightforward about what's going to be on the exam, so people have a fair chance to study. So,
Thank you.
yeah, no problem.
Thanks so much.
All right, have a great weekend.